Take a little trip with me, I'm gonna take you home.
Take a little history down this lane of memories.
Down this lane.
So let's raise another glass for the glorious past and the friends we have become. Yeah, 'cause little did we know the good times come and go, but the best is yet to come.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. My guest today is one of India's most highly regarded industrialists, and his columns in newspapers are usually considered compulsory reading. So why does he think that the budget has failed to tackle the core issue facing the economy, and what does he think the finance minister should have done? Those are the key questions I shall put today to the co-chairman of Forbes Marshall and a former president of CII, Naushad Forbes. Mr. Forbes, in an article you wrote for the Indian Express just days after the budget was delivered, you said, "The budget has missed the core issue facing the economy. It was not the budget we needed." So let me begin by asking you, what do you believe is the core issue facing the economy today?
The core issue facing us today, Karan, is the slowdown that we all recognize. We're growing, as you know, at the lowest nominal rate in 40 years, the lowest real rate in over 10 years. And we've seen depressed investment now for many years, for about 8-9 years. These are the issues that we really need to address up front. And I think starting in the budget, as I mentioned in that article that you referred to, I think one should start almost in a budget by saying, look, this is how things actually are. And if you actually make it clear that we are in economic trouble, that we are in a slump, that we need to address this in a very concrete and comprehensive way, then that public position, I think, would enable a series of actions that are more significant than we saw in the budget. It wasn't that it was a bad budget, but it was a sort of business as usual budget at a time that business isn't usual.
In fact, in that article in the Express, you made 4 explicit criticisms of the budget. And the first was the one you mentioned here.
Yes.
That it simply did not acknowledge the seriousness of the problem facing the
Yes.
country. Now, I want to ask you about that. Do you think the finance minister failed to acknowledge the seriousness, the size and the depth of the problem because she didn't want to alarm people? Or do you fear something worse? That this is a sign that the government is in denial?
I don't think the government is in denial. In meetings that we've had, in private meetings that we've had with the finance minister and indeed with the prime minister, as you know, the prime minister has had a series of meetings with industrialists in the run-up to the budget. There were maybe meetings, 6 or 8 meetings with different groups of industrialists. And at all these meetings, from what I've heard, I wasn't at them, but from what I've heard, he was open to input. He was keen to understand exactly what people felt, and he was very receptive, making notes, asking questions, making comments. He was engaged and very keen and interested and open to what was going on. So I don't think the government is in denial.
But that's behind closed doors.
That's right, but no, it wasn't reflected in the budget. Maybe, as you mentioned, maybe it's this concern that, look, we'll alarm people, that that things are more cyclical. You know, as things start turning up, then they'll start, the upturn will in itself feed on itself and start leading in itself to more virtuous behavior of investment and, you know, taking some more risk and so on. But I worry that we've been in this slump for too long, and if we don't publicly acknowledge where we are, we will not take enough action, because if we publicly say that things are okay, then why do you need to take a lot of dramatic action?
And that's the problem. If you don't actually acknowledge the seriousness of the problem, you haven't given yourself a base on which you can take radical measures.
Exactly.
Is that why this budget, as you said, was a business as normal budget? It wasn't a response to a crisis.
Yeah, I believe so.
So her failure to acknowledge in public meant that she wasn't able to either diagnose properly or prescribe the remedies needed.
I think there wasn't enough of a base laid for the significance of the measures that are required.
Now, your second criticism was that you believe there were two specific measures the finance minister should have announced which would stimulate the economy. First, you said the Indian government owes some 3 lakh crore to private and public enterprises, to social sector schemes and to state governments, and you believe this should have been paid through because it would stimulate the economy.
Yes.
Let me put you in a sense what her response might be. She could have said that I've already allowed the fiscal deficit to rise to 3.5%, and that doesn't include the off-budget items. Now, if I do what you're suggesting, the fiscal deficit could touch 5, even 5.5%. That would kick up interest rates and throttle private investment. How would you respond to that sort of concern?
So I think there are two issues facing the economy. One would be the actual budget deficit. Second is an issue of liquidity. Because of the cash-based accounting that we follow in the government, there's a difference between liquidity and the actual deficit that we show. Because the government hasn't paid a significant part of its bills of things done in this current year, and I'll come back to what the budget did, which I think was very welcome, which is to actually declare, I think for the first time, it quite prominently listed the dues of the central government that were not included in the budget. And this was very welcome transparency. Now, if you're going to show that, why not just borrow, pay it? Because if you pay it, yes, it'll count as part of the deficit, but in any case, you're acknowledging that you owe this amount to various parties. Why not pay it such that the money, the liquidity actually goes into the economy, which can then generate more economic activity?
And you then get the full benefit of transparency rather than leave the transparency hanging in the air.
That's right. You get the full benefit of transparency, and you get three benefits. You get the full benefit of transparency. You get the multiplier effect of the liquidity going around and generating more liquidity and economic activity, and even more usefully, next year you get a real benefit because you've paid this off, so it now will not count as next year's expenditure. Today, by having this show as dues of the central government, of the union government, when it gets paid next year, it'll count as next year's expenditure instead of counting as this year's expenditure. So it will actually enable going forward a control over the deficit.
In fact, you're making a second very important point. Not only by not paying these dues has she not got the full benefit of her transparency, she also, in a very important sense, hasn't got the full benefit of the actual deficit. The actual deficit is higher than she acknowledges, but because she's not actually spending that money or paying that money, that deficit is there on paper. It'll worry people on paper, but the benefit of the deficit isn't going through in terms of liquidity.
I believe so. I think it would, now I'm not, she was in a tough position. She was constrained fiscally without question. She was constrained by the FRBM itself. She wanted to adhere to the norms of the FRBM. I appreciate all of that. And how would you handle the fallout of saying that we're breaching the FRBM? I appreciate all of that. But I think dealing with that kind of an issue in a concrete way and saying that, listen, maybe this one time we have to breach the FRBM such that we can then next year be back within the norms of the FRBM because we've paid off these dues, etc. Maybe that's something that's an alternative that should have been explored, and maybe it could have been even publicly explored.
But the intriguing thing is that today she's been criticized for the fact that the actual deficit as opposed to the official one is considered to be high. That's because of her transparency. And yet the benefit of that deficit, which is increased liquidity, more economic activity, isn't going to happen. So she's getting the blame, but the benefit that should have followed has been lost. So in a very real sense, she's lost out on both counts. Transparent but no benefit, high deficit but no benefit.
Well, I don't know about the finance minister losing out, but I think as an economy we're losing out.
Absolutely. Now, the second measure that you thought the government should have taken, which it didn't take, which would stimulate the economy, was, as you said, to tackle the non-banking financial companies, which are in a sense of crisis, and as you said, they're directly connected to the real estate sector. What exactly would you like her to have done? Because I don't think you spelled that out in the article.
I didn't spell it out for a good reason, which is that this is not my area of expertise in any way. But let me say what I understand of the situation. What I understand of the situation is that there are many NBFCs which are very stressed at present. They're very stressed at present because they have lent to developers, real estate developers, not to people buying homes. That's not stressed, actually. The bad debts have not risen, NPAs have not risen significantly for people buying homes, but the loans that have been made to developers are where the problem is. Many of these NBFCs that have lent to developers find that the developers are unable to repay their loans. They're unable to repay and service their loans because they are left with a legacy of huge unsold inventory of housing, particularly. Not only do they have this huge unsold inventory, because they've got into trouble, they're not then completing projects. So you have a combination of unsold and unused real estate inventory, and you also have unfinished inventory, which is the worst kind because it's still further away from being monetized and turned into useful economic activity. So how do you handle this problem? Now, the usual way, an economist would say that the usual way is that the market should clear. Prices should fall. If prices fall, that will actually enable more people to buy, and things will start moving again. Why does that not happen? It doesn't happen below a certain floor in the real estate sector, because the moment you start marking down prices, then what you've borrowed against, the asset that you borrowed against, which is the worth of the project, drops. And then those projects would also have to start now being declared as NPAs and so on. So it's this logjam, as far as I understand at present, between the loans that have been made to assets that are not moving. That's what needs to be addressed in a concrete way. My understanding is based entirely actually on what Arvind Subramanian wrote in a recent paper on our slowdown, where he talks about setting up a bad bank, which can really help some of these developers refinance these projects, complete some of these projects, and get that sector sorted such that the NBFCs that do not have a solvency problem, that have decent assets and decent and loans that are not higher than the assets, that they at least can get out of this problem by completing projects, moving on, selling some of, it's a liquidity issue that can be addressed, and some of the sector can start moving again.
The interesting thing about what you're saying is that people like Arvind Subramanian have clearly laid out some sort of plan or a route map for what the government can do if it wants to act. It could have followed that advice. After all, that came from a former chief economic advisor appointed by this government. Had they done so, it would not only have tackled the NBFCs, but that in turn would have helped the banks, because the banks are biggest loaners to the NBFCs.
Yes.
It would also have helped the construction sector, which is the second biggest employer in the country,
Yes.
and that would have tackled unemployment. So her inability or her failure or unwillingness, one can choose whichever word one wants, to act here has actually had multiple consequences.
So actually, I wouldn't have any problem if this was not tackled even in the budget, if it was being tackled separately.
But even that's not happening.
It is being tackled separately. The NBFCs are being tackled, but I believe they're being tackled too slowly. We're doing, in a sense, too little on the ground with the speed that we should be doing to really address the whole sector in a fundamental way. I'm not sure, I think it'll come back actually to a point that Arvind Subramanian had made as the CEA when he was doing the economic surveys a few years ago, where he talked about a trust deficit between, if you like, capital and public perception. And he talked about the need for us to build greater confidence in the capitalist system, greater confidence in industrialists, greater confidence in the economy working for everyone's benefit.
But those are steps the government has to be the first to take.
Yes,
I mean, the onus is on the government to act.
I agree that the onus is on the government to act. Unfortunately, I think also we in industry do not adequately repay that trust.
Okay.
We could do more.
There's no doubt that this is a two-way process, but the ball has to first be kicked by the government. And as you said, they may be doing a few things outside the budget, but they're doing them very slowly and not effectively. And having tackled it in the budget would have sent a decisive message, which would have had a multiplier effect, and that wasn't done.
I believe that's what I wrote about.
I'm going to take a slight deviation at this point. I know you have two more criticisms of the budget, and I'll come to them in a moment's time. But let me first ask you, what do you think of the strategy she's adopted to stimulate the economy? To some extent, she's hoping to boost consumption by cutting income tax for those who avail of the new regime. But she's mainly relied on boosting the economy by pushing up investment. Do you think in the present circumstances that was the right strategy?
So I think there's very little that the government can directly do to boost demand and to boost consumption in the economy. What they can do is to actually invest in infrastructure, and through the spending on infrastructure to create employment, through the employment to put money in the hands of people who are employed. What we actually have seen in the past is that if you actually try to stimulate the economy directly by tax cuts, it actually has a much lower multiplier effect on the economy than by directly creating employment. So the infrastructure investment is a very good thing.
Except that, can I interrupt? This is where the 3 lakh crore that you
Absolutely.
said she should have put in would have helped.
Yes.
Because that would have gone and been spent. It would have added to consumption. It would have created
Exactly.
demand. It would have stimulated the economy.
Exactly.
So
That would
not
have-
doing so actually was a big mistake.
That would have been a very direct way to actually stimulate consumption in the economy, because you'd have had 300,000 crores more of liquidity available for consumption.
And much better than trying to stimulate consumption by giving income tax cuts.
I believe so.
Even better than the corporate cuts of September?
Even better than the corporate tax cuts of September. The corporate tax cuts of September, I think, are good for the medium term of the economy and the long term of the economy. They will show and higher investment over time by companies, but it will not stimulate the economy in the short run.
And at the moment, we have a short-term crisis. We need
Very
to
much.
boost growth immediately.
Very much.
You're suggesting that stimulating consumption by paying her dues would have been the best way of doing it.
I believe so.
Is stimulating demand through investment the right way of handling a short-term crisis? Because that's what she's opted for largely.
I think it is. I think it's the right, I think a budget has to balance short-term priorities with the medium and long-term. And for the country in the longer run, without question, we need a massive infrastructure push. Whether it's in roads, whether it's in airports, whether it's in railways, whether it's in ports, we need a massive infrastructure push. And that does end up stimulating the economy. Even in the short run, it's limited only by how fast you can get those projects actually moving.
Let me put you a criticism that's been made of the way she's implementing this strategy to boost the economy by stimulating investment. Shankaracharya, former chief economic advisor, has told me that an 18% growth in government capex may be sizable, but it's what you expect in a normal year in India. It's not a response to a crisis. And separately, Pranab Sen, the chief statistician, says that the new allocation, the increased allocation to the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana or rural housing is only marginal. Neither of them are impressed. Are you impressed by the way she's putting money in, or do you also share this belief that her strategy may be the right one, but she's not backing it up with enough money?
The budget reflects those numbers that you mentioned. But I think we should also look at things that have been announced that are not part of the budget. For example, the 100 trillion investment in infrastructure over the next 5 years. That's a very major and sizable infrastructure investment program that's been announced. The details still need to be worked out, I believe. The estimate is that out of the 100 trillion rupees of investment, 40% will come from the government, and the balance will come between foreign investment and the private sector. Now, the foreign investment was addressed directly in the budget through the tax-free status that was conferred on sovereign wealth funds that could invest in infrastructure projects in India. So I think that one piece of that $100 trillion picture was addressed directly in the budget. It's an enabler. It will actually enable this investment to come in. How much of it comes in this next year will depend on how these projects actually get conceptualized and rolled out and the speed with which that happens.
What about the need to involve the Indian private sector? That presumably depends upon a new architecture. The old architecture, most people believe, is now not really of much value. We need a new architecture. Is there one being put in place?
So actually, there is a new architecture that's been emerging. What got us into trouble on the earlier public-private partnerships was that these partnerships were put out without the necessary government clearances in place. So, for example, a contract was awarded to build a road, but the acquisition of the land that the road would run over was not actually in place. There were delays in the acquisition of that land. The developer, because of those delays, got into trouble in terms of his or her own liquidity, and that then led to the project itself getting into trouble and then causing trouble for the firm more broadly. Some of those lessons have been learnt, and now as projects, these public-private partnership projects are put out, they are put out with more clearances in place, or maybe on the other side, the developers themselves are more cautious about laying down conditions that say that, look, any delays will not be to our account if the necessary clearances have not been actually provided in time.
So critics who point out that she's relying hugely on a private participation in this 100 lakh crore investment in infrastructure over the next 4 years, and that she hasn't got the architecture in place, and that clearances remain a problem. Those critics aren't completely people you agree with.
I think they're not completely right. I mean, are there elements of things that we could do that would be more tangible in putting some of these pieces together? Yes, I'm sure we could. But I don't think the criticism is entirely well-founded.
Let's then at this point come back to the remaining two criticisms you make of the budget in your Indian Express article. Your third criticism is to do with the way she has imposed protectionist import substituting tariffs on a whole range of goods, and you say this will adversely impact India's exports. You make the point of saying that every major exporter is a major importer. And secondly, she needs to boost exports because it's an engine for growth which she needs to fire immediately. Now, on the other hand, there's no doubt that she's under huge pressure from small traders who are a sizable element of the BJP's political support base. She needed to do something to help them. Do you think she made a mistake by doing it by increasing tariffs, and she should have instead allowed the rupee to depreciate?
That's been my view all along. I believe that the best way of actually protecting the Indian economy is by having a competitive exchange rate. And if you look at the exchange rate and how it's moved over the last 5 years, we should actually be at an 80 rupee dollar. Because if we're at about 80 rupees, then the rupee today would be at about the same real exchange rate as we were 5 years ago. That would help both Indian firms compete against imports, and it would boost exports by making Indian exports much more competitive. And it would do that like no other measure to either protect Indian firms or to enhance exports. Much more attractive. It doesn't show up in the government deficit in terms of export benefits. It's entirely WTO compliant. And it's very attractive because you don't need tariffs as a protective tool.
As you explained, allowing the rupee to depreciate would give her the protection she wants from dumping or from adverse imports. It would have also made Indian exports competitive. But the problem is that from what this government has from time to time been saying, they actually see the rupee exchange rate as a matter of national pride. Before he became Prime Minister, Mr. Modi used to criticize the UPA government for the fact that the rupee was no longer competitive in the way it used to be in 47. Is there a mindset problem here, where they see the rupee as a sort of emblem of patriotic pride?
I don't know. I think there are many in popular perception. I think there is this idea that a strong rupee is somehow a reflection of a strong economy. I think the growth rates that we achieve in the country are much more important. And if over the next 20 or 30 years we achieve growth rates that are 7, 8, 9, 10% year on year, the rupee will start strengthening automatically over that period of time as we as a country rise in world rankings.
At the moment, we have low growth rates and a highly priced rupee. It should be the other way around.
I think so.
Your fourth criticism of the budget is to do with...
But by the way, on protectionism, I did want to repeat the point that I think for 26 years, from 1991 to essentially 2017, we went in the right direction as a country when it came to protectionism. We kept reducing tariffs. We heard Indian industry, but we didn't listen to them, right? And we kept reducing tariffs, which is exactly what we should have done. Since 2017, I think that direction has decisively reversed.
And that's a big mistake.
And I think it's a big mistake. I think it's the government listening to Indian industry when it shouldn't.
The fourth criticism in your budget is to do with the fact, as you point out, that its arithmetic hinges critically on achieving the 2.1 lakh crore disinvestment target. Now, so far this year, the government has only disinvested 18,000 crore, although it's hoping by March 31 the figure will jump to 65,000. But is it realistic to assume that next year you can more than triple the 65,000?
So there are two pieces to the disinvestment target next year. One part is what is called strategic. I think it's called strategic sales, which I think we should just call privatization. We shy away, not just this government, the previous government as well, from ever wanting to use the term privatization. We should just get our heads around it and call it privatization. So strategic sales or privatization. The second is reducing the government share or public listings of companies. So for example, the listing of Life Insurance Corporation comes in the second category. It potentially has the potential of raising a very large proportion of that disinvestment target. And if the work starts now, as it has, then by the end of the year, it's quite feasible for that listing to actually take place. Now, having said that, we do need to see a lot of work happening quickly and now, such that by the end of the year, that LIC listing happens and it shows then in the disinvestment receipts coming in. On the strategic sales, some of it will come from things that we haven't been able to achieve this year. For example, the
Air
sale
India,
of
Concor.
Concor, BPCL, these are the ones that will actually provide a high degree of funds coming in. Air India is a very good thing for us to do, but for other reasons. It's a good thing because we should just privatize that airline so that we actually end up with a better airline and something that isn't a constant drain on the exchequer. I don't think it's going to result in that much money coming into the government.
In fact, is there a market for Air India? Because I presume at the price and given its liabilities, Indian airlines won't want to touch it, and foreign airlines have a cap of 49%. Would they want to invest such sums in an airline they can't control?
So it all depends on the terms. Air India does have some assets, particularly their flying rights around the country, around the world. And I think that makes it attractive. So I think there will be bidders for Air India, but the government has also said that they're going to sweeten it by taking a lot of the Air India's debt off its balance sheet, because no one's going to buy Air India with 50,000 crores of debt.
Absolutely. But
right?
then explain this to me. You sound as if you believe that 2.1 lakh crore disinvestment target can be met, and yet this was listed in your Indian Express article as the fourth major criticism of the budget. So why were you critical of this then?
So let me, because of the strategic sales part. On the disinvestment, I think we'll see that happen simply because of LIC, if we do the right work, because that's such a large share going forward, and the pent-up work from this year. On the strategic sales part, I'm more skeptical.
We may miss them.
We may miss them.
Which means we won't achieve the 2.1 lakh.
That's right.
Which
That's
means
where
that
I'm more concerned.
Fiscal deficit will be yet larger by the end of the year.
That's right. So I'm more concerned about the strategic sales, because I think that we need to start seeing a lot more of companies being put up for privatization quickly. You know, I think learning from the one time when we did actually achieve very significant sales, which was during NDA 1, during the Vajpayee NDA government, when privatization happened in a significant way. It's the one time that it's happened in a significant way in our country. And I think learning from that, it was done in a separate ministry of, I think, disinvestment.
Arun Shourie was the minister.
Arun Shourie was the minister. This investment happened in a very transparent way. It was a way in which the responsibility for disinvestment was taken out of the line ministries, transferred to a different ministry, which then set the price and so on.
But you're saying a very important thing. We know how to do it because we've done it before. And it wasn't an opposition government that did it, it was the
No,
NDA
it was the
in its
NDA that
first
did
version.
it.
It's strange that they want to go back to doing strategic sales, but they don't seem to be following the tried and tested path Mr. Vajpayee had laid out. They're reinventing the wheel just when they should be actually following what he did.
I think it would be very
Which
productive.
is why you're suspicious and doubtful whether the strategic sale element will be realized, which is why you think that 2.1 lakh disinvestment target, 2.1
That's
lakh
my
crore,
concern.
may not be met.
That's my concern.
Let me put this to you. If the disinvestment target then looks unrealistic or partly unrealistic, what do you make of the tax revenue projections? Because after achieving a tax buoyancy of just 0.5 last year, she's assuming a tax buoyancy of 1.2 next year.
Yes.
And I believe broken down that means GST has to grow by 12.8% compared to 5.8 this year. Corporate tax at 11.5% compared to -8 this year, and income tax at 14%. I mean, are those revenue tax projections realistic?
So the corporate tax projection is realistic because the -8 comes from the corporate tax cut. So once the tax cut is over, then the growth will come back.
What about the others?
The other ones depend entirely on an economic recovery. So it depends on us achieving a much more rapid growth rate than we're achieving today. If we continue to grow at 4.5–5% next year, I don't think there's much chance that we'll achieve those tax revenue goals that we've put in the budget.
The finance minister has projected a nominal GDP growth rate next year of 10%.
Yes.
Given that in the year that's ending, nominal growth was just 7.5 and real growth seems to have slipped below 5, is a nominal growth rate next year of 10% realistic?
It depends on what inflation is.
Well, absolutely.
So you know because it's interesting that this budget didn't mention a real growth rate. It only mentioned the nominal growth rate number. Now the budget by definition always has a nominal growth rate target, but very often in the past the finance minister has also mentioned a real growth rate target. This budget was silent.
And inflation at the moment
is
7.5 plus, 7.59, although it may come down. But
so if inflation is 5%, we'll achieve 10% nominal growth.
And if inflation is 6%, we're achieving 4% growth.
That's right.
So she may hit the 10% nominal growth target,
Yeah,
but you're
but that
worried that inflation may do it rather than actual growth.
That's right. And if we achieve the 10% nominal growth largely through inflation, then the tax buoyancy that's assumed in the budget numbers won't happen.
Which means, once again, her fiscal deficit will rise hugely.
But if we achieve the 10% with 7% growth, real terms, and 3% inflation,
we'll all be singing the Hallelujah chorus.
Exactly, and the tax numbers will happen.
Except that's what I want to really ask you. Given what you think the state of the economy is today, and given what you've said about what she's done, and where you feel she could have done a lot more in terms of the 3 lakh crore that the government owes, which would have really boosted economic activity, what do you think will be the state of the economy 1 year down the road on the 30th of March 2021?
Well, I'm not a professionally trained economist, but the answer of economists that I love is the words, it depends. So if you say, what's the state of the economy going to be in a year from now? It depends on what we do between now and then. And when I say we, it both means what the government does and what we in industry do. Maybe we can talk about both.
But you're being very diplomatic. Everything always, it depends.
Yeah.
But given what she's done so far, and given the plight we're in, are you hopeful that we're going to manage 6 and 7% at the end of the year?
Well, it depends on what we see happening post the budget. So if we see the right kinds of actions taking place on privatization, so either setting up a separate ministry, whether it's a separate ministry or a separate department, or putting a separate group together that comes under the PMO to drive a disinvestment process or whatever, but something that institutionally starts driving privatization as a major plank of government policy. That'll be one piece.
Except there's no sign of it as yet.
No sign of it as yet.
No talk of it even.
So I'm saying these are the kinds of things that I would like to see. And if we see some of these pieces, these institutional pieces falling in place, then I would have greater confidence in these
Well, you're
numbers
saying
actually happening.
two things, if I've understood you correctly. If many things that you'd like to see,
Yeah.
a separate ministry possibly for handling privatization, and other such measures that will boost the economy and give confidence, then we could achieve 7%.
Yes.
But at the moment, there's no talk even about these things. If we remain with what she's done in the budget, and further bold action doesn't happen, then what do you see the situation a year later?
So, I said it depends on both what the government does and what industry does. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what industry needs to do too. I believe that we talked about protection a little earlier on. I think protection is really the government responding to industry when, as I said, it shouldn't. It should actually hear industry and then do what
And you're
it thinks
saying to
is right.
fellow industrialists, stop putting pressure for import substitution and protection.
Exactly. So, and going with that's a negative thing. Don't keep asking for protection. But there are also positive things we need to do in industry. And there are two things that we need to do in industry in particular. First, in industry, we need to be much more internationally focused ourselves. So we need to be investing overseas in export markets. We have an opportunity that's very considerable today as China gets more and more expensive and as the sourcing of many products moves out of China to other countries. We have an opportunity which we need to take. It's not only about government policy, it's also about the ambition of us in industry and of our individual firms in industry. The second thing that we need to do is that we need to be much more technology focused. We need to invest a lot more in in-house R&D than we have been doing all these years. Both those measures are entirely within the responsibility of industry and within the freedom of industry to do if it chooses to now.
Let me pick up on the first point you made about the opportunity that is available for Indian industry to grab markets that are so far been with the Chinese, or to grab investment that is leaving China and looking for new homes. So far, that investment has gone to Vietnam and Bangladesh.
Yes.
The finance minister hopes by cutting the corporate tax rate for new companies to 15%, she'll attract a fair amount of it. But to what extent are India's fairly rigid labor laws a problem? And to what extent are also government clearances which slow down projects a problem? Because that seems to put people off.
So government clearances are not a problem for general manufacturing investments. Yeah? Government clearances tend to be more of an issue for larger infrastructure investments. So I don't think government clearances are the issue here.
Labor law and land acquisition?
Labor laws and land, even land acquisition actually. There is enough land available for general manufacturing industrial investments at different places, different parts of the country. Labor laws is much more of an issue, and it's much more of an issue especially for attracting the kind of industry that's been moving to Bangladesh and Vietnam, which is the garment industry. An industry that is it's very labor intensive, and labor laws keep labor costs high. And when they keep labor costs high, then the industry tends to move to places where those essential costs are lower. That's one part of it. Second is actually our engagement with free trade agreements. Bangladesh has duty-free access to both to Europe under a special provision for it as a very poor country. India doesn't. So garment exports from India experience a tariff of 10% in Europe. The same garment exports by an Indian firm operating in Bangladesh do not have that 10%. So you need to sell at a 10% lower cost from India simply to match the cost that you're selling at from Bangladesh.
And labor costs in India make
and
that
labor
impossible
costs in
to
India
do.
are higher too.
So would you say that something that would fire up animal spirits is if the government were to tackle the labor problem in the next 9-10 months?
I believe so.
And you would like to see the limit raised from 100 to 300 all the way into the thousands?
Yes, it's not only the that's right. It's not only the Industrial Disputes Act, and it's not only there are actually some of the pieces are in place. They need to get implemented. In 2014-15, the government talked about various labor reforms that they wanted to bring in. They were not able to. At that time, they didn't have a majority in the Rajya Sabha, so they were not able to.
But they do now.
Now they could carry it through. I'd love to see it come back.
In blunt language, would you say they need to bite that bullet of hire and fire? Hire and fire becomes
is
an
not-
unpopular term, but I'm using it on purpose.
So
You
hire-
have to have the right to be able to sack when you need to and hire when you want to.
You need flexibility. You need flexibility in hiring. The flexibility in hiring can come from different sources. One of the things that this government has done in its first term is that it brought through a program of fixed-term employment.
think that's
It's a
sufficient
very
to attract
useful.
investment?
It's a very useful measure that's been brought in. It has not yet been notified by the states. It needs to be notified by the states.
And many of the states
for
are
it to
controlled by
become
the
law.
BJP, so
Yeah,
why
yeah.
are they holding up?
There's no difference. If you look at the Apprenticeship Act, which was passed in 2014, again a very good act that came in that made it much more flexible for apprentices to be employed by Indian industry. It took between, I think, 2 years for the earlier state, and maybe even now there are some states that have yet to notify that law that was passed in 2014.
But you're saying a very important thing.
And-
There are many
and there's
sensible
no-
things
that's right.
the government has done, like the
Yes.
Apprenticeship Act, like the fixed-term
Yes.
employment scheme, but they haven't even got their own states. Leave aside
Yes.
opposition states, their own states
There's
to notify.
there's been no difference between the states ruled by the BJP and states ruled by the opposition
So they're
in
doing
implementation
themselves
of
a huge
these laws.
disservice. They've come
I
up
believe
with
so.
sensible solutions, fixed-term employment being one, Apprenticeship
Yes.
Act being another, but they're not actually making sure they're implemented. So
Yes.
good ideas get left hanging in the air, and once again, the benefit
That's-
either for the government or for industrialists doesn't happen.
I believe
Which is
that's-
why animal spirits are not at this moment fired up.
Yes, yes. So, I mean, these would all be enablers in themselves. They're not going to dramatically change things, but they will add up to a package that will change things.
If they happen.
Yes, exactly.
Let's take a break at that point. When I come back, I want to talk briefly about some of the general suggestions you've made about how governments tackle budgets over the next few years, because I think those are very important things to bring up. But first, a message from our sponsor, Glenlivet, as I take a sip from this reassuring glass.
Take a little trip with me, I'm gonna take you home.
Take a little history
Take a little
down this lane of memories.
down this lane.
So let's raise another glass for the glorious past and the friends we have become. Yeah, yeah, 'cause little did we know the good times come and go, but the best is yet to come.
Welcome back to a special interview for The Wire. My guest is the co-chairman of Forbes Marshall and a former president of CII, Naushad Forbes. Mr. Forbes, I want to now come to two further points you've made about how governments should treat budgets in general in the future. The first point you make is that we should move away from cash-based accounting to what you call an accrual-based system of accounting. You point out that every Indian company follows an accrual method, and increasingly foreign governments do. What would this involve when you make the move, and why is it so important?
So the essence of accrual-based accounting is that you match revenue and expenditure in time. So when you match the expenditure associated with a particular revenue. So for example, as a company, if you make a particular sale, if you sell a product, you associate all the costs associated with that product in the same accounting period where you recognize the revenue. That's the essence of accrual accounting. Cash-based accounting doesn't require this. Cash-based accounting, you start accounting for things on the basis of when the cash comes into your account and when the cash goes out of your account.
Which is why you can have a mismatch between expenditure on food and fertilizer
Yes.
and the payment of it. The payment could happen a year or two later.
Exactly.
And that gives a false idea of the actual truth
Exactly.
fiscal deficit.
Or you just don't pay your bills and it doesn't count as expenditure.
So the problem we have with the fiscal deficit, when people say it's not real, there's a lot that's hidden, there's a lot that simply isn't paid, that would completely disappear if you had an accrual system.
It would make it very much more transparent, number one, and more than anything else, it would remove the disincentive to not pay.
And as you say, every single Indian company follows an accrual-based system
Yes,
of accounting.
by law.
By law. So the government is the only exception in the country.
Yes. So, for example, I mean, where this came across to me was I was chair of one of our leading institutes, educational institutes. And whenever I would get the accounts, I would really struggle to understand them because of cash-based accounting, because I really couldn't get my head around, it seemed like I couldn't tell whether, we'd had a good year or a bad year, because we still seem to have some money in the account, but did we have money in the account because we hadn't paid people, or because we'd received something that was actually an advance on the next year? I couldn't
And
tell.
the same is true of the government's budget.
On a much larger scale.
Because the government
So,
doesn't reflect what it's owing people, it postpones its payments, it makes purchases without paying them, and as a result of which you have a very misleading, if not sometimes false idea of the state of the government.
I believe so.
And all of that would be corrected if you switch the method of accounting.
It would be a much more disciplining system.
Now, secondly, referring to Vijay Kelkar and Ajay Shah, you say, and I'm quoting you, we must build the institutional infrastructure for the complex economy we are. Instead, we rely on the discretion of politicians and bureaucrats. Can you explain what precisely you're saying there? Is it that there's too much discretion built into our system?
I believe so. I believe so. That's a broader point that goes beyond the budget. So maybe I could make one other budget point, and
Of
then
course.
we come to this. The other point on the budget is that I think the budget needs to become much more of a non-event in our country. If you look at the US, for many years now, no one knows when the budget is actually presented, passed, etc. It's a footnote somewhere. In the UK, the budget used to be a much bigger event, even going back to Margaret Thatcher's time. But in these last 20 years or so, the budget has become much less of an event, even in the UK. Today, again, it's almost a passing fact that the budget was presented. The same thing needs to happen for us as a country. Yes, we need some kind of a statement that talks about the intent of the government, its economic policies more broadly, etc., that can be done as part of the budget or separately. And then the budget simply needs to be, look, this is how the accounts add up, and this is how they expect it to add up for next year. So it needs to become, I think, much less of an event, both for the government and for all of us who sort of, follow it and cover it.
But that would only happen if you had a clear series of indications outside the budget from
Yes.
the government of what it planned to do. Because
Yes.
the government for the rest of the year is silent, people keep hoping that maybe the budget will be when they'll speak.
But I don't think the government the rest of the year is silent. I mean,
The last government has certainly
So,
been taking action,
yeah.
but they've been taking action from July onwards because of the sense of growing crisis.
Yes.
As a result of which they had to give SOPs to the automobile sector, SOPs to real estate, particularly to corporate. But normally, it's the system in India that the budget becomes the moment for big announcements. You're saying spread them out
Yes,
and let
exactly.
the budget be an accounting exercise.
Exactly.
Come now to
So,
this question where
yes.
you quoted Kelkar and Shah. Why is the lack of discretion, the opposite, why is excess of discretion such a problem?
Because the moment you rely on judgment, discretion, choices that are made by bureaucrats and politicians, I think then you need a system where you will have good decision making that happens right across the system. As we get more and more complex as an economy, as we get more and more diverse, more and more sectors, more and more service and manufacturing mixed up, I think more and more people participating in economic activity, I think we need to rely much less on going to someone and saying, here's what we need, and the person deciding whether or not you should get it. And much more on the institutions and policy that will determine actions of people.
So you should have a simple set of rules. If
Yeah.
you meet the requirement, you get it. If you don't, you don't.
So-
it shouldn't be at the discretion of a politician or a civil servant.
Exactly.
Because when things are left to people's individual discretion, there's also capacity for either cronyism
Exactly.
or some form of corruption.
Well, and I'm saying, even if you have no corruption, if you're simply relying on someone deciding,
It's
then
arbitrary.
It's arbitrary by its nature. So that's why, for example, if you take, say, protection, right? You have one tariff breeds another tariff, because one tariff will, someone suddenly finds that, okay, there's a tariff on XYZ import, therefore I'm less competitive now because it's an input to me. So you go to the government and then say, okay, listen, we need a tariff on the product that I make. And you have this cascading of tariffs, which is unintended, but a consequence of these individual decisions that are made. If you have a more overarching framework where you say, okay, all inputs will be at a maximum of 5% tariff, all output products a maximum of 10, and there'll be no other tariff.
Get individual decision making out of the system. Let there
Exactly.
be a set of rules that are followed for everyone.
Exactly.
Now, the finance minister, in her budget speech, did tackle one concern that people have been expressing: tax terrorism, harassment by the tax authorities, and she's promised a taxpayers' charter. And no doubt that's very welcome. But isn't it contradicted by the fact that all governments, including this government, keep setting unrealistic tax targets which put pressure on tax collectors to be aggressive? So on the one hand, you talk about a taxpayers' charter, but on the other hand, you're pushing your collectors to actually aggressively do the opposite.
So it's still, if you put that pressure on tax collectors, they will use what power is at their disposal. So if you remove power, it's a good thing.
But even days after, and literally a week after she announced her budget promising a taxpayers' charter, the Indian Express revealed on its front page that the government has set a 2 lakh crore target to be realized in 45 days flat under the Vivad Se Vishwas scheme. So on the one hand, she's promising amelioration. On the other hand, she's unleashing hound dogs.
Yes, absolutely. And and by the way, this comes back again to some of this cash-based accounting, because it means, what you're trying to say is that, listen, never mind what we're due, make sure it's in our account, right? Never mind if it's going to be disputed later on, collect it first.
So it looks as if it's a good amount this year, even if you have to refund a lot of it next year.
That's right.
Once again, it's a form of blinding yourself by a deliberately accepted self-illusion.
I think so.
Finally, you're one of the rare people in your article who suggested that the government should impose an agricultural income tax on incomes above 50 lakh a year. Why have you set the bar so high? 50 lakh a year is more than 4 lakhs a month.
Yes. The reason I said 50 lakhs a year, because I said that, no one should be able to object to that, right? How can anyone object to taxing an income over 50 lakhs? Who knows, right? I believe there's this huge exception that exists in the country, right, where a lot of income is shown as agricultural income because that way it escapes tax.
And I suppose there's another benefit.
And I think, by the way, there's some very wealthy people in the country who have agricultural income, and they should pay tax.
And I suppose by setting the bar high at 50 lakhs a year,
correct,
you make it easier for the government to do in the belief that it will only affect a small number, not most farmers. But once the principle is established, you can keep lowering the bar.
Yes, if you want to. But I'm saying at least start with 50 lakhs, right? Because the moment you do that, you at least remove this huge open door of exemption. Where you simply say that, where did you get all of this money from? By the way, I believe it's one of the reasons why demonetization was so problematic, because all people needed to say was that, it was agricultural income.
Except for the fact that if you set the bar at 50 lakhs a year and above, which is more than 4 lakhs a month, and a lot of people are going to say, I don't even earn 1 lakh a month or 2 lakhs a month, and I'm paying tax, and yet a farmer who allegedly earns over 4 lakhs pays no tax.
I'm saying start there.
Start there.
Start there.
What are the chances that the government will bite this bullet? For 70 years and more, we've been talking about the need for an agricultural income tax. No government has had the courage to do it.
I know no government has had the courage to do it. At some point in time, it has to happen. At some point in time, agricultural income can't be treated differently to other income.
And you're hoping that Mr. Modi,
I'm
who is
hoping
strong
that
enough
some
to do something
That's
as rash as demonetization, will be strong enough
hoping-
to do something as wise as this.
I'm hoping at some point some government will do it. If none of us talk about it, there's no chance of it happening.
All right, Mr. Forbes, a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Karan. Thank you.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.